All right, I guess I'll get started here today. So you can see I'm going to, I like to, I guess, post-exam, more on that in a second. I like to kind of just explore a little bit of a special topic, something that kind of is a nice way of reviewing what we already know, but also pushing us forward. So we're going to talk a little bit about international trade today. It's also kind of a neat issue, or a neat thing to talk about because it's prominent, I'll say, in the news also. But before all of that, let me say a few things about the exam, what happens next, and all of that. So first of all, whenever obviously I'm teaching a big class here, and I have one TA, and so it's always a gigantic logistic enterprise getting through the exam. And I really appreciate the way everybody sort of, did what was asked of them in an organized fashion. We had 109 people take the exam. I was able to get them all graded and all back to you within a day. And I couldn't have done that if you sort of didn't meet me halfway. So I appreciate that. And the other thing is, maybe not everybody feels this way, but I felt like it went really, really well from the perspective of just how everybody did. I spent a fair amount of time thinking about putting an exam together that was challenging, yet also reflected the material. And by and large, I feel like everybody did really well. So, of course, it's always the case that things happen, people are surprised. I don't know, various things happen, and you might not have done as well as you would like. My last bullet point here. All right, it's one exam. I make the final grades. I curve the final grades usually, but I also take into account special circumstances, people who improve steadily over the semester, people who did poorly on one exam but well on two others. You have your homework grade and your attendance grade. All of these things are there. So if you didn't do as well as you would have liked, that's, we'll get it next time. And it'll be, everything is still out there in terms of your grade here. But as a practical matter, what I would like you to do is, well, first of all, if you did not get a copy of your exam via Gradescope, let me know immediately. You can send me an email and I can figure out what happened there, because I took the roster from CUNY First. I took all of the exams that were handed in and I matched them up and sent out emails of that way. And so something might have been broken in the chain there if you did not get your exam. So if you didn't, please let me know and we'll fix that immediately. When you do have your exam, you can look at it carefully. I tried to make the rubric and the answer key as clear as possible so you can see where you lost which points. Gradescope is nice that way. And if you think that there's something amiss, or, I do make mistakes, but I know it's hard to believe. If I did, let me know. I'm happy to fix it. I'm also happy to listen to arguments about, how I graded or classified your answer unfairly. I do like arguments, though, like, I drew this line here because of this, and I thought that, so therefore I need some points back or something. I don't like to, I need this class to get an A in this class to graduate, so I need points back. That's not an argument, right? Fine. Also, I do have a little extra credit assignment I've posted, and I'll talk about that at the end of class. If you want to do that, you can do it. I think I assigned it as homework, so we'll see. Maybe but it's yet another opportunity to increase your grade here. Okay, so corrections. Oh, the other thing I might mention is if you do find a mistake in the grading, it's likely that you might not only help yourself, but you might help others, because I can change the way certain things are graded on Gradescope, and it sort of makes the change for everybody. So maybe that's an additional incentive. And I do prefer that you do these things either via email or through the regrade requests, because it's nice to have a record of what I've done and what I've fixed and all that. Sort of a digitized record of everything. Okay, and yes, I was reminded before class, if you haven't done all the homework up till today, you still have till the end of the day today to finish it. It looks like almost everybody has done the homework. So, yes?
Old question. The practice exam, we're not penalized for not having
No.
it in. You said that was voluntary.
The practice
exam doesn't factor in, right?
Right, does not factor in. The practice exam, none of that's, the practice exams, I should say, don't factor in. You reminded me to say one other thing here. My plan is to, once the dust settles with all the regrades and all of that stuff, I'm going to try to get everything that you've done in the class to date into Gradescope. Into Brightspace, and sort of show you what your grade is as of, this, 1/3 of the semester, just so you have a benchmark. And that's my plan, is to kind of get everything into Brightspace, so it's all there for you to see. Okay, so some other things, if you need help, we do have a TA, right, Daniela. She has her office hours, I believe Wednesday 4 to 5. But there's also now our tutoring center is open. And it's really a great place to go, and just if you have general questions about anything. It actually is the case that these are our master's students. And so you help them by making them explain ideas to you. But you also get a chance to not only get your questions answered, but maybe to learn a little bit about the economics major and things like that, or even the BA-MA, which is our joint bachelor's master's program, if you're sort of liking what's going on in economics. Question, yes?
Where can I find the link to Gradescope?
I'm sorry?
Where can I find the link to Gradescope?
It should just come to you via an email. If you didn't get one, send me an email, and I can I'll figure it out. It's hard to kind of do it while I'm standing here.
Can I do it on Uni First or something?
Yes, or you could just go to gradescope.com and. I think on Brightspace I sent out an email about what to do, about to get your exam scores. So if you didn't get that, then please let me know. Okay, so moving on, right? I don't have much else to say about the exam beyond that. I've already said. So what we're going to do today is start diving into part 2, I guess, of the class, which are, I guess, applications of supply and demand. So it's kind of like this thing where what we're going to do is extend what we know about supply and demand and the basic ideas underlying the graphs, and see how we can extend them to think about all sorts of policies. And so today what I thought we'd talk about is how we might adapt our supply and demand tools to think about international trade and policies like tariffs and maybe quotas. That's a little harder, but we'll see if we have time for that. But I would also like to remind you that behind the scenes are maybe even more general ideas here, right? In that whenever we think about a policy, the very first thing we want to do is think about the counterfactual, right? And what I mean by that is when you sort of say, okay, well, if we have this policy, this could happen, right? But this could happen relative to what, right? What is it we are comparing the world to when we think about this policy? So one example that I often think about is every X amount of years, I don't mean to push your opinion on this policy one way or another, we discuss whether or not there should be horses in Central Park, right? Some people think we should ban the horses, some people don't, however you feel about that. But I'd like to suggest that maybe you think about what happens when you ban the horses. Maybe what happens to the horses, right? What is the outcome there? Do they wind up in a meadow somewhere running around, or is it something perhaps not so great, right? Maybe the horses meet their end in some other way, right? But you have to seriously think about that, right? Whatever you say about the policy, what happens, right, in the end? So you always need a baseline, right? There's A and there's B. And a lot of times that's sort of lost in a policy argument. And we're doubly lucky, and then we have these things called consumer and producer surplus that come right out of our diagram that give us a nice benchmark to start with, and then show us what happens when we put the policy in place, right? And we can see costs, benefits, where they tend to fall, who wins, who loses. And so whatever you think about the policy, right, you have to sort of come to grips with the basic geometry of consumer and producer surplus. And trade is a really nice way to sort of see all these things and how they might work. So here we have a market. I've kind of developed a fictional market. It's T-shirts, right? You might think about this as generally the mass market textiles, right? That makes it a little bit sexier in that this is a market that, believe it or not, has kind of an interesting history in the United States. And so we'll think about T-shirts to be concrete here. And you can see that what I've done is I've drawn up this market here so that we have a price. This is in the absence of trade, I should say. So that's our counterfactual, right? We're going to start off and say, okay, well, first of all, is trade good, international trade? Well, we first have to start and say, well, what does the world look like without it, right? Counterfactual, that's what we're doing here. So our exact counterfactual here is without trade, we would have 40 million of T-shirts made in the United States every year, and they would sell at a price of $8. Of course, I should have better numbers here so you can figure out all these things. When you're looking at this graph, I'm hoping you're seeing it and sort of imagining the consumer and producer surplus, right? The triangle below price yet above supply, producer surplus. Below demand, yet above price, consumer surplus. That area, those two triangles there, tell us the total gains from exchange or the total societal welfare in this market, as many of you expertly calculated on your exams. So it is interesting. I mean, I know I shouldn't go on tangents all the time, but it's actually a very interesting market. Years ago, we had someone come in and present a paper as part of a job market talk. We were trying to hire a professor, and she did this really neat research where her and her colleagues had looked at the impact of tariffs on textiles across the entire spectrum, right? From low end, T-shirts you might buy at Costco. I shouldn't say low end, just like bargain price T-shirts you might buy at Costco or Target or something, and all the way up the spectrum to designer Italian suits. And one of the interesting things was that a conclusion was that tariff laws substantially increased the price of the low-end textiles, but not so much on the high end, right? So when you buy an Italian suit, you're not paying a lot of tax on it, but when you buy a T-shirt at Costco, you kind of are, or at least that was her conclusion. Okay, so we have to think about, first of all, once again, when we make a model of something, we have to think about just the mechanics of how it works before we run off and analyze the good and the bad and the outcome. And so we have to think about how trade might impact our diagram here. And so we typically think about it this way. For a beginning, right? Start off as simply as possible, if you can. And we're going to do that in this case. We're going to imagine that there's some world price of T-shirts out there that is lower than our market price. My example here is $5. Right? So what does this mean? It means that people in the United States at the going world price can buy and sell as many T-shirts as they want at this $5 price, right? So importers send, we can earn $5 in the United States, we earn $5 everywhere, we'll ship our shirts around the world to get this price however we have to. Of course, we're abstracting away from things like shipping costs and all of that, which in reality are quite important. But we're just trying to keep it clean here, right? Keep the ideas at a basic level. And of course, we can always go back and add in more difficult things. Okay, so a $5 price, if that's the world price of a T-shirt, assuming free trade for the time being, right? We started out without trade, price of $8. At this $5 price, well, we now can make two observations. If that's the world price, given that all T-shirts are the same, again, another assumption, people in the United States will only buy shirts at $5, right? You're not going to buy an identical T-shirt from someone selling it at $8 when you can get it at $5, right? This means that our domestic market has to conform to this price, right? Otherwise, nobody will buy shirts. By the same token, if you're a producer, you can't sell a shirt at greater than $5, right, in the United States. So when we add this $5 in there, everybody has to conform to it, buyers and sellers. Okay? Once again, your wheels might be turning and you might be saying, I don't like any of those assumptions Baker just pushed on me in 30 seconds. Great, right? That's part of the exercise. File those away and complain about them once we understand the mechanics, or argue, I should say. Okay, so $5 here. That's all we can sell at. That's what everybody can buy at now. We can now look at our diagram, and we can think about this. Maybe it's reminding you of something we've already talked about. It's a little bit like a price ceiling now, right? With one important difference. The price ceiling does not really create the shortage that it does when a standalone price ceiling does, right? When we drew the price ceiling before, we drew the $5, and then we said, well, if the price is $5, 20 million people provide T-shirts, and 60 million people want them at that price. Well, here with an international market, now both things can be true, right? People can buy 60 million T-shirts, and domestic producers can supply 20 million. The difference, of course, is imports, right? So one way of reading this diagram is that when the world price is below the natural equilibrium price, once we allow trade, well, the price comes down in the United States, and producers in the United States, well, their production falls from 40 to 20, and consumption increases from 40 to 60, right? So, and if you read between the lines there, quite literally, right, 20 to 60, that becomes our imports, right, at this world price. That is lower than our international price. So, if we wanted to sort of think about all of this, by the way, is maybe the predictive side, as we say, the positive side of our model. What happens when we allow trade? Well, in this market where the world price is lower than the U.S. price, we see that domestic production falls, domestic consumption increases, and the gap is imports, right? That's a very simple mechanical prediction about how it all works, right? Okay, but as economists, hey, you know what? That's kind of insightful in and of itself, right? But what we really care about is whether or not society on the whole wins or loses from this, right? That's really what most of our insights are about. And once again, we can make this a matter of simple geometry by just thinking about how the surpluses change. So look at my second bullet point. If we think about no trade, right? Well, A is consumer surplus with no trade, right? B plus C is producer surplus with no trade, right? When we start off at the $8 price and 40 millions of T-shirts. So A plus B plus C are our isolation, I guess you could say, gains from exchange. A plus B plus C, the producer and consumer surplus. But when trade comes along, and you think about what I said about imports here, the price that people get shirts at is $5. The price suppliers get for shirts is $5. They can be different in the United States because the gap can be made up with imports from 60 to 20 here, right? And that's fine, but it doesn't really change any of our logic about how the surplus is going to work here. So now that giant green triangle, A plus B plus D, is the new consumer surplus, right? Everything below price but above, everything above price but below demand. C is producer surplus, right? So now we have some conclusions we can make from all of this, right? We can say, all right, well, consumers gain, right? Their surplus has grown from A to A plus B plus D, right? So consumers have an increase in surplus when trade is introduced of B plus D, right? And you can see my before after A plus B plus D there. Producers have lost something here, right? They used to have B, but that's gone. Actually, it's not gone. It's kind of captured by consumers, right? When the price goes down, some of the producer surplus goes to consumers now. And they're left with only C, right? So if you just work out the before and after, you can see consumers have gained and producers have lost, right? From trade. And that kind of jibes with what your intuition might suggest. Well, when an international good can come into the United States at a lower price, that helps us as consumers, as buyers of T-shirts, but it hurts anybody who wants to, who is selling T-shirts, right? But what can we say about the gains versus the losses? Well, we can say that the gains to consumers outweigh the losses to producers, right? So A plus B plus D is A plus B plus C plus D is greater than A plus B plus C, I might say it that way. So you can see where this comes from. D, right, is the gains from trade, from international trade, right? That's what we get when we allow international trade as a society. Yes?
Are the distribution for these kinds of gains, or does that vary a lot by good, or is it just, or do we see that general distribution across?
Okay, so that's a great question. The question was, are there gains in general, and what about the distribution? So there's a couple subtle things there I'm going to say. We would suggest that this is true in general, right? You can relabel these axes as anything you might want, right? And the logic of the graph will be the same. Now, the other thing you said, though, about distribution is interesting, because it turns out, and maybe I'm twisting the question a little bit, it is possible to redistribute the gains from trade. So, for example, we could create a fund, and we could all donate, some money to that fund, and then we could give that fund to displaced domestic T-shirt producers in such a way so that everybody wins from trade, right? This is a more complex Hicks-Kaldor, you call it, efficiency, which you'll talk extensively about if and when you take Eco 200 or 300. That it is, right, when society gains, it's possible to make everybody gain. You might say it that way. So I don't know if I answered the question, but of course you can change the slope of the curves and that'll change the size of the triangles, but the triangles will obey these rules. Maybe I'll say it that way. Yes?
Are the gains from world trade always that triangle on the bottom, or does it?
Okay. You could say, I'm going to say, whenever the world price is lower than the domestic price, right, yes, the D box is always the gains from allowing world trade. But there are these other things we have to think about, right? When the opposite is true, when the world price, right, is greater than our going, as we said, the official lingo is autarkic, we call it, right, price without trade. But we'll just say our price without trade. Okay. Oh, by the way, I said a winner, domestic consumers, losers, domestic producers. Winner is international producers as well, right? They're happy to have access to the United States markets. We'll see more on that in a second. Okay, what if and this might speak to the question about the gains and whether or not this is a general result. Well, let's look at it this way. Let's look at this diagram here, where now we're thinking about a good where the world price is above the going domestic price. And so my example here is something that the U.S. typically has an advantage in producing. Airplanes, right? Large-scale skilled manufacture goods. By the way, there's some manufactured goods like that the U.S. does not have an advantage in, which will be interesting later in the lecture. Anyways, so here we imagine that we have a market for airplanes here where we have, our domestic industry without trade would produce 400 a year at a price of $100 million. I don't know if that makes any sense, but those are my fictional numbers, which seem to be in the ballpark. That's where 100, 400 is, and once again, we can see the surpluses before there's any international trade. A plus B is consumer surplus, C is producer surplus. Now, it turns out that out there in the world, not so many people are as skilled as the United States at making airplanes, so we expect the world price to be higher. And so if we allow free trade, well, the world price is 150 now, right? And we can do the exact logic that we just went through, right? Where we can say, all right, well, let's see here. When we allow international trade, well, this hurts United States consumers, who I guess in this case would be domestic airlines who have to buy planes, right? Their surplus is now A, up there, right? Where they buy a lot fewer airplanes than they did before. their airplanes fell from 400 to 200, and at this price of 150. They're more expensive. Right? Well, why is this the case? Well, producers are happy to have this opportunity to produce goods overseas. 100 to 150, right? You can see that they now they make 700 airplanes a year, right? And sell these, both domestically and around the world. In fact, we can look at this diagram and we can see that, well, domestic producers domestic consumers buy 200 airplanes. The entire world buys 700 airplanes, so 500 airplanes are exported, right? 500 of these airplanes are exported. And once again, we can do the exact same surplus math we did in the previous example, but here, now the line is above equilibrium. So the surplus is before, consumers have A plus B, after they have A. Producers before have C, after they have C plus B plus D. So we can see that producers gain from this and consumers lose, right? But we can also say that society on the whole gains from trade, right? Why is this the case? Well, the D triangle, right? Now it's above the equilibrium, and that's the new surplus that's in the problem that was not there before, right? So we have gains to world trade from D. But once again, this doesn't mean that we have overall gains, but there are this group of losers, not in general, but in this particular example, those are domestic consumers of airplanes. Once again, it's beautifully, it sort of emerges beautifully here just from our simple understanding of the geometry of supply and demand, right? Kind of a neat example. Question, yes?
So there's no deadweight loss in change?
Oh, there's a gain. In fact, you know what? I'm glad. The question was there's no deadweight loss. You might say that the deadweight loss occurs when we prohibit trade, right? So we have our before and after, our counterfactuals. Well, if you flip those around, you can say, well, prohibiting trade creates a deadweight loss. Indeed, right? So that's a good way to say it. By the way, most economists would agree on this, so more on that later. One thing we could do is you could even imagine, here I have, kind of a model where we have the entire world market here and all the loops are closed. So I switched markets. Here we're talking about sugar. And in this situation, you can sort of add an additional dimension to all of this. Over here we have a country that exports sugar, right? And there's a world price like that. We draw the line across, and the world price is what this importer, right? I have Brazil and the U.S. as my example. The United States is an importer of sugar. And so you can see here that, the U.S. has some gains for trade being an importer, and Brazil has some gains from trade from being an exporter. Now the last little ingredient you might add is the horizontal distance here in Brazil should equal, if there's only Brazil and the U.S. in this market, the two horizontal lines should be equal in length, right? That is to say the horizontal part of both triangles should be equal, which would mean imports and exports are equal, right? So you might think about it in this more complex way. For our purposes, I think I have this slide because a student always asks, well, how do we know that the amount that people want to export equals the amount that they want to import, all of that stuff? Good question, right? You could resort to this sort of logic here. So one thing I'll do is I'll throw in a shameless pitch for our international trade course, where you learn all sorts of fascinating things about trade and exchange rates and stuff like that, if you sort of like thinking about these problems. Okay, you know what? Maybe now what I'll do, I'll do it at the end of class. I'll take attendance because I have something else I'm going to do on Top Hat anyway. Okay, so it's kind of neat. You can see all these things in a very simple way on these diagrams. So what we're going to want to do is, well, first of all, just kind of assess everything we've said here, which is how all these things work, just the various interests here. An exporting country, right, when they can export, when they couldn't before, the winners are their producers. Their industries are helped by this. Their consumers lose because, the price goes up to the world price. The importing country, right? I say more common probably. Well, it's because people don't really complain when their country is exporting things, right? But we worry when we're importing things, right? So maybe I'm trying to focus you in a little bit on this particular case, that import restrictions tend to be more common than export restrictions, right? We don't, for example, say, I'm worried that we're exporting too many airplanes to the rest of the world, right? Maybe we should. I mean, as soon as I said that, I was thinking military airplanes, right? That's a big export good. So maybe we should, but we don't commonly worry about our exports, is what I'm trying to say, right? We worry about the fact, oh no, we're importing too many cars from this country, or we're importing too much of this good from that country. But it's worth noting then, or paying special attention to the fact that when we import, consumers win. Our domestic producers lose. And so one reason maybe why we care about this, more on this in a second, is that oftentimes interests for restricting trade are concentrated where the benefits are diffuse, right? So a good example of this is recently we had a longshoreman strike, I guess, in the United States. And obviously longshoremen care a lot. In this case, it was about automation. They care a lot about losing their jobs, and for good reason, right? People care about that stuff. But of course, when the costs go up in a port, this impacts consumers all across the country for just about everything. But it might only be a dollar here or a couple of cents there on the sugar or coffee that you buy. So in that sense, maybe you don't notice. So you have sort of a sharp producer interest weighed against a diffuse consumer interest. And we'll get into that in a little bit here. But generally speaking, we can say that however diffuse these things are or concentrated, our logic says that there's always this D triangle in either case, right? That there are winners and losers, but the winners gain more than the losers lose. Okay, so that's just a general case for trade. You might ask, well, what does a tariff do? Well, we can use this whole logic to sort of think about this in our supply and demand diagram. And the tariff will just kind of show us that there's an intermediate case between no trade and free trade. And the tariff kind of can take us from one to the other and kind of looks like something in between. And I'll show you how it works here. But first we have to deploy some logic that we love to do, which is we assume everybody's rational. And what this means is that when we're faced with identical products, right, we'll just buy the product from the cheapest source, and this will in turn impose some sort of behavior on the various actors in the market here. So once again, let's start off with this world price of P, right? What does this mean? This means that there's some supplier out there in the world that can get P for the product anywhere, right? If you produce a t-shirt in Germany or Thailand or the United States, you can ship it and sell it for P. Once again, we're abstracting from shipping and selling costs, right? So what if we just decide to slap a tariff, I'll call it of amount T, if you want to think about it as the price is $5 and T is 6, right? Or a T is $1. Well, that, it's sometimes good to have a concrete example. What would happen if we slapped a $1 tariff on t-shirts out there, right? I'll just call it T here generically. Well, a supplier says, all right, what is a tariff? A tariff means whenever I sell a t-shirt in the United States, I have to pay T, $1 to the U.S. government, right? Or the I don't know where it goes actually, the U.S. Customs, right? Maybe that's it. Okay, so my t-shirts go in here, 10 go in, the price is $5, but now I have to give $1 to the United States. I'm not going to do that if the price in the U.S. is $5 and the tariff is 1. Reason being, I can get $5 everywhere else in the world. Why would I send any shirts to the United States if I get 5 minus T, or P minus T generically, right? So you can see here, P is the price everywhere else. Now with the tariff, P minus T is the price in the United States. Doesn't make any sense. So what we can surmise is that if the price in the U.S. minus the tariff is less than P, right? No one in the world is ever going to send a T-shirt to the United States. Once again, this is, if you want to think about it, in a more sophisticated way, this is our assumption that actors are rational, right, being deployed in this trade context. So international producers are rational. So the punchline here is that the price in the U.S. minus the tariff has to be the same as the world price, right? So otherwise, nobody will supply a shirt to the United States, no international producer. So you might say, in my example, you would say, okay, well, if the price is $5 in the world out there for a T-shirt, and we have a $1 tariff, that means the price in the United States is going to be $6, right? Why is this the case? Well, a U.S. price of $6 and a world price of $5 means that a producer or a seller of T-shirts gets the same amount everywhere, right? Because 6 minus 1 is 5. That's what they're getting in the U.S. market. 5 is what they're getting in the world market, right? So, generically speaking, the tariff will increase the price in the United States by the amount of the tariff. You add in shipping costs, you add in goods that are a little bit, U.S. T-shirts are a little different than T-shirts made in, Germany or Thailand or wherever. Fine. It'll change, it'll change the workings of this a little bit, but the basic logic is the same. So what does this look like then? Okay, well, now you'll notice we're using our free trade counterfactual, our free trade as the counterfactual. So if you look here, I have the world price of the good just written across the bottom here. And maybe I'll draw this up on the diagram as well. I'll draw this up for you as well. I feel like I should use the board at least once every class. But when we put the tariff in, we raise the price by the amount of the tariff, right? And you can see that what this does is now, instead of having a price of the world with the big consumer surplus triangle, we cut into the consumer surplus triangle a little bit. Well, this increases producer surplus a bit, decreases consumer surplus a bit, but also destroys part of our gains from trade triangle, right? So B plus C plus D is lost to domestic producers and or consumers really. I guess the good news is that C is tax revenue, right? This is the amount of imports right here. The amount of the tax is the difference between the two prices. Once again, I'm going to draw this up in a second. So you multiply the height by the base, you get that purplish rectangle C there as tax revenue. So maybe that's, some of the good news is that we get some tax revenue here. And you might think about that as a benefit, right, that the government now gets. Fine. But B and D are lost, right? Those are gains from trade that are lost because of the tariff. Of course, if you wanted to, if you pushed the tariff all the way up to the domestic price, right, now you're back at the autarkic or the no trade situation. There's no trade revenue, and you're just sort of back at the place we started the class at, right? So you could have a tax high enough that it prohibits any imports. So let me just kind of do this sequentially here on the board so you can kind of see. Maybe kind of it's like a live time lapse of everything here. It's kind of unfortunate the tray is on the other side. I should have thought about that. Okay, so here's my supply and demand, quantity and price. I'll just draw in a demand like this, and we'll have a supply like that. Many of you noticed that I did not label supply and demand on the exam. That duly noted that I should have. And we add in this, let's see, I will add in this line here, which supposes that we have some free trade, right? So that would be, you might say here is the natural price and quantity domestically, but we'll just sort of cut to the chase and add in this price, this world price here, right? So we can now do out all the surpluses as we've been doing them. our world surplus, or our consumer surplus here with world trade is this up here. This marker's no good. Is this up here, I'll say. It's a little better. Right? That's consumer surplus with world trade. Down here we have producer surplus with world trade like that, right? Now when our tariff comes along, right, we have, what we do is we add in a new line here, right? So this here is T, the amount of the tariff, right? So the price in the US is equal to P world plus T, right? Like that. Now, we can see what happened. Before, we had, this was our imports, like this, right? Total imports. The distance between what was supplied domestically and what was consumed domestically, that's imports. Well, after the tariff, this shrinks. Right? Now, our imports have fallen. So, if your objective was to reduce imports, the tariff should do the job, right? At least this predicts that's what would happen. Now what we have for surplus is we've kind of lost all of this, but our consumer surplus is this whole area. Let's see if I can hatch it in the other direction. Is this whole area up here, right, after the tariff. Our producers, right, once again, domestic or imports have fallen, right, but domestic producers now have all of this surplus, right? So their surplus has now increased. And so that might be the other idea, or the other thing you're trying to do is restrict imports to benefit producers. And in that sense, the tariff does its job, right? Okay, but at the end of the day, you know, we do have this thing here as tax revenue, right? The taxes of this amount, the tariff I should say is this amount. This is the number of imports. You take the number of imports and multiply it by the amount of the tariff, you get the return. So if the government wanted to make money, I guess it's accomplished some objectives, right? If you want to think about the multiple objectives here, protect domestic producers, well, that's this box, right? Make some limit imports, that's the fact that this amount has shrunk to this. Make some money, that's this box. So there's check, check, check. We've made those three things, but you know, we like to say in economics there's no such thing as a free lunch. What have we lost in doing all of this? Well, we've destroyed some of the societal surplus that was there before. These two triangles are now gone, right? So that's the lost, the deadweight loss, you might say, from the tariff, right? And that's kind of the internal workings of the whole thing. Done out. I know my markers aren't great, but at least you got to sort of see it work through like that. And of course, you know, if I gave you some numbers and all that stuff, maybe we'll do that if we have time in the future. We'll just work through a numerical example. But you could do it without too much trouble, right? Once you understand what the basic geometry is here. Question? Yes. What is what? Free trade? Well, free trade would, I'm not sure what the question is. What is free trade? Or okay, so in general, okay, so maybe that's a good place to start. That would mean that you can export or import anything from anywhere, right, around the world, at whatever price the market will bear, right? That would be kind of the definition of free trade. More on that in a second. So the quotas, you know what? Let's skip over this. I kind of took more time with that stuff, and I want to keep moving. But the quota does kind of, and maybe I'll just quickly talk about it, you know. But you don't have. This won't be on an exam or anything. A quota does about the same thing as a tariff, is really the lesson. But the one different with the quota, I'll talk about what that is in a second, is that the gains to the quota typically go to a foreign producer of a good. So what is a quota? Unlike a tariff, which attaches an additional cost to importing or exporting something to the United States, a quota just says you can only export this amount to the United States. So a prominent example, Japanese cars, right, for many years were subject to import quotas, meaning Japanese could only sell a certain amount of cars in the United States by law. Now, of course, we all know that there's ways to get around this. For example, you could make the cars in the United States, stuff like that. But strictly speaking, what would happen is something like the following, where you think about the part where this line is flat here. You see the supply curve kind of has a shape where it goes up, across, and then up again. The flat part is the quota, right? If you want to think about it, that's the imports that come in from overseas. And so you kind of just say, all right, well, we supply some cars on our own, then we import as much as we can at the quota, and then our supply takes over again. And so the result is kind of the same thing as the tariff, right? We wind up with the higher price domestically, but we don't have as many cars as we would with free trade, if we're talking about cars here. And this higher domestic price, well, it does about the same thing as the tariff. Now, the one difference is, if you're the Japanese auto producer lucky enough to be exporting cars to the United States, you're excited, right? Because now you can get a price higher than the world price, right? It's something like the Japanese automaker getting the tariff, right? And so that's fine. Usually people say, well, they don't actually get the tariff. What happens is they have to lobby to get the quota awarded to them in the first place, and that's kind of effectively a tariff, right? Anyways, okay, so that's a little more complex. For our purposes, this is kind of what I would like you to sort of, I don't know if memorize is the right word, but just, be able to reproduce this and have its internal logic down. Okay, so now, this is the way, and once again, I'm trying to kind of show you how an economic argument might evolve. You might first set out a simple model of something, right? Describe the internal logic of that model. That's what we've done here, right? We've talked about winners and losers and overall gains to society. But now you might say, okay, well, what if we push it a little bit further? What if we think about a situation in which we can think about all these exceptional arguments that one would make, and usually they're of the flavor, these are some of the prominent arguments in the trade literature, or in the trade debate, I should say. Usually they're of the flavor of, you have to think about something that isn't in the supply and demand model, right? And I like this because it says, all right, well, we know now that if we have trade, it has some cost. If we restrict trade, I should say, it comes with some social cost, right? Destruction of the trade surplus. That's the cost. If we have imports, restrictions, if we have tariffs, well, we might have to think about reasons why we would want to bear that cost, right? Why would we want to make our consumers pay a higher price and reduce consumer surplus, say? And you could say that these are possible offsetting gains, right? National security arguments is a prominent one, right? We want to be able to make our own oil. We don't want to import oil. We don't want to import grains, all of these things, or maybe other critical resources. So we need a tariff, which we know restricts imports, so we can kind of do these things, right? Or protect our national security interests. Infant industry arguments are common as well, right? So what is the idea here? The idea here is that we want to protect some critical industry from too much competition from overseas, right? This could be, so back in the 80s it was semiconductors. Everything was about we need to make our own semiconductors. Nowadays it might be something like green technology, or we need to protect these industries so it can grow and become a flourishing industry. There's also dumping arguments. You might say, well, the international price is too low. There's some foreign producer out there who's flooding our market with cheap goods, knocking our domestic producers, nefariously knocking our domestic producers out of business, right? We want to protect against that, right? And of course, there's the jobs protection sort of argument, right? That, well, we want to protect jobs. Now, these are fine, and they're sort of outside of the typical supply and demand apparatus, but they're all, in one way or another, they're all very hard to defend. In particular, the last one, the last two are pretty difficult to defend when you think about them in a little bit more sophisticated way, just using the logic of our argument. Yeah?
Can you go back to the last slide?
Sure.
I don't know about job loss because it also creates jobs like globalization. This is kind of what you're leading into, right?
I'm going to, but now you're stealing my thunder. As much thunder as one can have in an 8:30 economics lecture.
We may lose jobs, but since the country that's better at it can lean into it more efficiently, they probably can create jobs,
Okay, so this is a fascinating thing when we talk about inequality. I'm glad you went in a very good direction, but a slightly different one than I'm going to go into. But yes, we are citizens of the global economy, right? And so when we protect our jobs, those are jobs that are lost overseas, right? And that's going to be incredibly important when we talk about inequality, right, and its progress over time. There's a fascinating diagram that will show in some ways the massive gains to world trade. It's almost unfathomable when you see it that have occurred in the last 40 or 50 years, mainly around, in other parts of the world, most notably. We'll get to that. Yes. Yeah.
To sort of pick up on it, similar. Right? We talked about domestic car production versus international a second ago. As you mentioned, some of those companies end up moving their production to the United States as a way of getting around quotas or tariffs.
Yep.
Is that not job creation for American workers?
Oh, okay, yes. So this is interesting. So there's a famous economist, we'll talk about this in a couple lectures, who said for every intended consequence from a regulation, there are 3 unintended consequences. And oftentimes, the unintended consequences, which I love to talk about, are interesting, and I don't know if you could argue that they're welfare enhancing, right? That is to say that they're better than doing nothing, but it's an interesting argument to have. So a great example of this, we're going way off the beaten path here, is NASCAR. I think I mentioned it before, right? So the reason why we have NASCAR in the United States, it's a great example because some of you might think of it as a good thing and some of you might think of it as a bad thing, is because of prohibition, right? When we prohibited alcohol in the United States, bootleggers had to figure out how to get their product to market, and their preferred method of doing so was in a fast, nondescript car, right? A jacked up stock car. So the natural thing to do once you're a bootlegger and you're good at this is to prove that you're better than others, right? So this began the whole practice of stock car racing, which developed into NASCAR eventually. So that was an unintended consequence of that, as I'm sure people did not think about when we have import quotas on cars that Japanese firms will become an integral part of industry, primarily in the South, right? Tennessee, Alabama, places like that. Nobody saw that coming. Interesting, right? All kinds of crazy things happen when you have these laws here. So I'm going to go in a different direction, though, and I'm really glad that you guys, sort of added something to it without stealing my thunder, as I'll say. I have enough time to do this. So, anyways, infant industry arguments. People thought, this argument has actually been around for a long time. Back in the 1800s, War of 1812, it was a raging debate about whether or not we should have protection from English, primarily textile producers. Alexander Hamilton was a big proponent, right? And he was like, we need this to get our domestic manufacturing up and running, right? So we had a whole series of these tariff restrictions, 1816, 24, and 28, the so-called Tariff of Abominations, 1828. And it's interesting in that we're sort of split on whether or not this actually worked at the time. It seems like it might have helped the United States industry develop, right? So this is the kind of one interesting case. More on that in a second that we're not so sure about. But it is, by the way, if you wind up taking my history of economic thought class, there was a whole school of thought that kind of, it's the so-called German historical school that rose up with this as the fundamental idea. It was that an infant industry was critical and that you needed to protect it. One of the problems is that, there's all kinds of problems with this. It's, first of all, we have to agree about what industries are important, right? It's almost never the case, picking winners is really hard. We're going to see why later in the semester. It's very hard to sort of say this is the critical industry. Witness all the people that wanted to be computers, or all the people that want to be computer science majors, right? Or programmers. We said that was a great profession to get into 10 years ago. Now it seems a little dicier, right? If you've, played around with AI at all, right? So there are these things that happen. It's hard to pick these industries ahead of time. I was thinking about this in the context of our exam, where, back during the pandemic, the supposition was that everything was going to be done electronically, online, exams, homework, all that stuff. Yet here we are, 5 years later, doing our exam with pencil and paper all in class, right? That was a technological outcome no one really saw coming. So it's hard to do these things. And meanwhile, of course, we're beating up on consumers. So that might be one problem with this infant industry argument. In addition to I have the breed a wild animal in captivity argument, right? Like, I'm pretty sure that if you took the tigers at the Bronx Zoo and released them into the wild, they would have a hard time surviving, right? Unlike the tigers that actually grow up in the wild. And so it is, in some sense, with infant industries, is that oftentimes what happens as a practical matter is you start off with subsidies for the industries, and they never go away, right? It's never the case that the industry can function without a subsidy. There's a lot of reasons for this, which we probably don't have that much time to get into, but there is this interesting example. I like to sort of think about why it seems like the tariffs in the 1800s worked. There's a lot more examples on the other sides of the ledger where the things that I'm talking about have kind of emerged here. So for about a century now, we've had tariffs on sugar. And the idea was that we thought at one time sugar was this important thing that went into everything that we should protect. But it turns out that we've been basically maintaining tariffs for about a century now in the sugar market, when there's a lot of places around the world that are just much better at making sugar and can do it much more efficiently. Of course, you might say, well, that turned out to have a good unintended consequence, and that sugar, it turns out, is not great for your diet, so making it a little bit more expensive might be a good thing. Okay, well now we're getting into second order stuff. Shipbuilding. The 1920 Merchant Marine Act required all shipping between U.S. ports, right, to have American-made ships that were crewed and registered in the United States. So to this very day, shipping, right, ocean shipping between U.S. ports is really expensive relative to going internationally. By the same token, we don't really even have a U.S. shipbuilding industry, right? All the big container ships in the world are built elsewhere, right? Hamburg, Holland, those are the places where these things roll off the lines, right? So it's kind of an interesting outcome there. Synthetic fuels, for a long time, this was the big thing back in the 80s, is we were subsidizing ethanol production, right, as an alternative to expensive gas. It never quite went away, but it never really became the way to make gasoline either. It seemed like a great idea that just doesn't turn out to be cost effective, right? And so this is kind of the general pattern, is that it seems like we have protection, but 10 years down the road, it's still there, and it doesn't seem to be that great of an idea. So national security is another, kind of, you can fold it in there, right? And so you might say, well, these industries, say steel, critical to our national interests, right? We want to be able to make our own steel, say, right? Or our own oil. But, okay, one thing about oil is if we import it cheaply from other places around the world, as we've seen, there's benefits. And it also turns out we can make our own oil on pretty short order if the price goes up. And in fact, I have an example where we'll discuss this later in class, right? Really the lesson is production is more elastic than you think, right? Put another way, the minute something becomes expensive overseas, we start making it in the US almost, right? Now you might say that's not the case for scarce resources, minerals, whatever, but if that's your argument, then isn't it a good idea to import them? Like if you say, well, there's only so much steel in the world, so we should make our own. Shouldn't we also import as much from elsewhere in the world how we can? There's sort of two sides to that coin. And once again, it's very, very hard to make predictions long term. And you might do a lot of damage in the course of doing this. And I love science fiction, and I love to watch old science fiction movies. And it's really interesting to think about, these are essentially predictions about what common knowledge or common wisdom would say the future will be like. So you look at Star Wars, one of the weird things is there's no computers, right? There's really very little screenage. Nobody has a computer. It's kind of weird, right? And why is that the case? There's no phones. Nobody saw that coming, right? These are things that nobody anticipated would be an important invention now, right? And as I mentioned, our exam, if you had told me 6 years ago that I'd be giving paper exams only in class, I would have said you're crazy, right? Yet here we are. And you guys were crushing it, so that was good. So prediction is difficult, especially about the future. You can even parlay this into this idea about dumping, right? Somebody's trying to sell us a bunch of cheap, stuff they've made ridiculously cheaply overseas. What's the problem? In some ways, you're sort of saying, well, some foreign country has decided to subsidize production and give us a gift in effect, right? Foreign taxpayers are giving us a gift, is the argument the economist Jagdish Bhagwati has made, right? And once again, if they, the argument is, well, what they're trying to do is sell at a low price, drive our industries out of existence, and then jack up the price. Well, that last part almost never works, right? Because domestic producers in the United States, say what you want about us as a country, we tend to be really good when it comes to making profit. And if there's a chance to make a profit, even for a little while, people flow into the gap here, right? Competition returns fast, right? Oil is a great example of this. And then, of course, in the meantime, you've given a gift if you're a foreign exporter, and this is your strategy. And oftentimes, anti-dumping laws, they come from domestic producers who are, as we suggested, they are the ones who gain from the policy more than, and they gain less than we as a whole lose. Okay, so wrapping this up here, job protection, right? Well, we need to put in some tariffs to protect jobs. So, for example, we might want to protect American textile workers. My point here, different than the points that were made, which were excellent, by the way, in class, is that some protection, it saves some jobs but destroys others. So think about it this way, t-shirts, right? There's a whole bunch of people that use, well, maybe we'll just go with textiles here. We might have a tariff on textiles, and that protects the textile industry, but think about all those people out there in the world, or out there in the country, who use textiles to make things. So there's, all the fast food restaurants have to make their uniforms somehow, right? They buy the textiles. Now you've increased their production costs. You've increased production costs for just about anybody who needs to make I get my example's a pretty good one, I think, uniform, but you've probably also increased costs for, upholstery in cars, furniture makers who maybe use fabric as well. In the course of protecting this industry to help this one set of workers, you've now harmed all these other industries that use things. And the lesson here is that inputs in production are often, goods that are imported just as much as they are bought and sold by consumers. In fact, the inputs are probably more important because, they go into making something else. So domestic producers also import an enormous thing. So oil is a great example of this as well, right? We all buy gasoline for our cars, but it also is a tremendously important import for everybody else. So maybe I'll touch the third rail here a little bit. Fair trade is a common cause as well, right? Where you say, well, I only want to buy coffee from fair trade companies, and so I pay a higher price. Fine, right? It might even be the case that this fair trade company that you're buying coffee from pays its workers in a foreign country more than the going market, a living wage, so to speak. Well, more often than not, that wage is going to be much higher than the going wage in that country, right? So, in some sense, what you've done is sort of created something like a price floor in that country, right? The reason I mention this is because you have to sort of think about this. All right, well, there's going to be a surplus that's earned by someone, right, in that country. Who is it? Is it really the worker? Or is it the person who owns the company? I'm not quite sure, right? So you do create this rationing problem, and you do wind up with this question as to, well, okay, now who gets to get this high price in this country? Who gets those jobs? And it tends to be an almost prohibitive problem in a lot of less developed countries, right? Squabbling over the surplus from high-paying jobs, right? Who's getting them? How are they allocated? Who's getting the money? Who's getting the jobs? I'm not saying it's not worth it, but just keep in mind, what are your counterfactuals, right? What does the world look like without the free trade, and or fair trade, and what does it look like with it? Okay, so that brings us. I have just enough time to do this. You know what? I'll do this too. We'll fire this up. I added an exercise in Top Hat, which let's see. It's you can take it as something, you want an extra opportunity to boost your grade here. It's there now, and maybe I'll take a quick attendance as well. And while this is up here, I will discuss the exam, or I'm sorry, this question here. Okay, so think about what's happened in class here. We've talked about markets, supply and demand, market equilibrium, consumer and producer surplus. Now we've gone down a laundry list of policies here. Price floors, price ceilings, taxes, tariffs, and in every instance what I've told you is that in every case these things destroy surplus, right? They invariably create losses that are greater than the gains. At best, they shift gains, right? Inefficiently from one party to another, right? You can apply this logic to rent control. You can apply this logic to minimum wages, tariffs, whatever you want. So here's the question that I pose on this. Hopefully you can, how are we doing here? We're at 58. You can apply this logic to this question here, or where I ask, you might say, well then Baker, why the hell do we see so many of these policies all over the place? Every state basically has a minimum wage. We have a federal minimum wage. New York has rent control. It's had it since World War II. Many places around the country have rent control. Many places around the world have rent control. Why is that the case? Why are there so many tariffs? You've just explained to us in a couple weeks here about why maybe for society they're not good. So why do we have them? That's what the questions are about. So then I go on, I say, what are the arguments for why, an economist has to explain this to his students? What do I say, right? So you're going to help me do that. And then I say, well, can you give me an example where one of these policies has worked? And if so, how has it worked, right? So this is where you get to play devil's advocate. And then I ask, well, where's a policy where it hasn't? Okay, we're up at 70, good, all right. I'm going to minimize this, I'll keep it open. And so there's these questions here, and they're just kind of open-ended essay questions. And my plan is ultimately to just kind of look at them, I'm not going to grade them right or wrong, but just make sure you've put a good faith effort into them. And then I'm going to try to collect, the logic. When we get a slack moment in time, I'd like to show you some of those supply and demand things you did at the end before the last exam. And I'd like to also talk about this stuff, because it's really interesting. But I do say here at the end, try to find something that you don't think someone else will do. You don't have to, but, whatever. Okay, so I gave you about a week to work on that. I'll remind you, of course, every day up until then to just spend 15, 20 minutes doing it.